Mă numesc Gavra, am născut în urmă cu 48 de ani, undeva în
My name is Dan Gavra. I was born and raised in Western Romania. My family was very poor, and when I turned 13, my father gave me over to a children's home. I ran away from there and ended up living on the streets for a time. Eventually, I ended up in a disciplinary school for 3 years. After I got out of that school, I moved back to my hometown, and at the invitation of my aunt, attended a Baptist church for the first time. In January of 1983, I had attended church only 4 times, but each time I felt very convicted by the Holy Spirit. I attended a revival meeting in a church near Urada. A preacher had a powerful message from the Word of God. Through the preaching, I was convicted and finally came down during the invitation to be saved.
At the close of World War II, the Iron Curtain began to descend across Eastern and Central Europe. By 1947, communism had taken root in the country of Romania, bringing untold devastation and hopelessness to its people. Much of the hardship that Dan faced in his early childhood was a direct result of the policies of Nicolae Ceausescu, the communist dictator of Romania, who came to power in 1965. Although Ceausescu was an avowed atheist and detested the sight or mention of religion, Romanians were permitted to keep and attend their churches under his watchful eye. His secret police infiltrated churches everywhere and permeated every aspect of the Romanians' daily lives.
Ceausescu had ruled Romania my entire life. He was ruthless, and no one dared to speak against him. He had secret police everywhere, and everyone knew that any small criticism could lead them to severe punishment.
In the late 1980s, winds of change began to blow throughout Eastern and Central Europe. Decades of economic decay, compounded with a growing yearning for freedom, began to generate a political change through the region. The United States and Western Europe displayed bold leadership and pursued peace through strength.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the end of 1989, communism began to fall in a series of countries: Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In November, the Berlin Wall fell, and Germany began the process of reunification. But most of Romania remained unaware of the changes in the world around them. Ceausescu's tight control of all speech and media was exceptionally strict, even by Soviet bloc standards. The collapse of nearby communist regimes only served to harden his resolve.
Most of our country did not know anything about the events in the rest of Europe. We had only state-run news and media, but here in the West, we could listen to Free Europe Radio, and here in Timișoara, we knew a little more about the events in Europe than most people in the rest of the country.
The good news of advancing freedom was not the only hope given to the people of Timișoara. In spite of oppression and persecution, the good news of the gospel began to spread in their city. Laszlo Tokes, a local pastor, led a growing congregation of believers. The message and size of the congregation soon became a threat to the Communist Party, however, so they ordered the forcible removal of Pastor Tokes from his church in Timișoara. Although Dan was not a member of Tokes' church, he and his girlfriend Slobodanka, along with many other believers, began to gather to stand for the freedom to worship and follow Christ.
Pastor Tokes had made statements to the Free Europe Radio about the situation in Romania.
I feel an irresistible urge now to say openly all the things I've choked back so many times before. Why should we always build ourselves into this wall of silence? This wall is more solid and impenetrable than the Berlin Wall. And I feel somebody must start dismantling this wall.
Because of these statements, the pastor was forced to leave the city. On December 15, a group of Christians began to gather to pray.
For the first time in generations, a group of Romanians stood in opposition to an order given by the communist authorities. Top's church sat directly across from a tram stop, and as the crowded cars unloaded, passengers saw the gathering of believers and the crowd quickly began to swell.
Around 6 p.m., the people who had gathered began to disperse and go about their business. I thought, surely it won't just end like this. So I gathered those who remained and asked everyone to pitch in whatever money they could. After gathering what we could, we went to the Orthodox Church and bought candles. I met with my pastor at the Reformed Church. I opened my jacket and showed him it was full of candles. I asked him, "May I light a candle to continue this gathering?" He responded, "Please, light a candle to keep people here."
The demonstration continued through the night and into the following day. As the crowd grew in number, it also grew in purpose. It soon became clear that this was more than a display of solidarity for Pastor Topes. For the first time in their lives, Romanians shouted their secret dreams aloud.
We were standing on the steps of the cathedral shouting different chants, demanding our freedom. Communism came saying, "God does not exist." The revolution was our way to respond, yes, God does exist.
Now the crowd had grown into a movement. Students began singing a patriotic song that the communists had banned years before. Awake, Romania! They began shouting, "Down with Ceausescu! Down with communism!" As the number of protesters multiplied, so did the military presence. Armed and ruthless, the secret police swarmed the area. As the crowd walked from the church into the city square, they waved the tricolor Romanian flag with the centered communist emblem cut out. Ceausescu and his men had enough and were determined to put down the uprising quickly and definitively. Ceausescu called in the order to fire.
As my group approached a bridge, there was a platoon set in 2 rows with their guns aimed at us. We cried out, "Don't shoot at us! We are unarmed! We don't want violence!" We went forward trusting that since we were brothers, fellow Romanians, that they would not fire at us. But when we got within 30 meters, without any warning, they started shooting. I could feel the bullets all around me. At that moment, I was shot in the leg. My girlfriend was at my side the entire time. When the shooting began, she was hit in the abdomen. Some of the demonstrators took me away to receive medical help, but I never saw her again. I was later informed that everyone who was killed had been taken away and their bodies burned.
In the panic and confusion, gunfire claimed hundreds of lives. Though the people of Timișoara were overwhelmed by shock and grief, they were now resolved to stand. To stand for freedom, for liberty, and for right. The protest in the city center continued as Dan was loaded into an ambulance. He was taken to a nearby hospital where the gaping wound to his leg was not the most pressing threat to his life.
After my operation, they gave me over to the care of a nurse that was a fellow Christian. She did her best to hide me and protect me because the security police were coming into the hospital and taking away anyone who was associated with the rebellion to eliminate evidence of the uprising. When the time came for me to be released, the hospital staff hid me and loaded me into an ambulance to take me to another hospital. That is how, by God's grace, I escaped prison and possible execution.
The people of Romania were outraged at the brutality of Ceausescu's regime and its violent conduct in Timișoara. Just days later, Ceausescu staged a rally in the capital city of Bucharest to denounce the protesters in Timișoara. But the enormous crowd that was assembled to support the nation's leader had grown weary of his lies and propaganda. Restlessness soon evolved into chants of Timișoara.
Manifestări populare din București, considerând aceasta ca o...
For the first time in his political career, a stunned and confused Ceausescu faced an unfriendly audience. Growing determined to see a swift and decisive change in their country, the unrelenting crowd swarmed the government building with the aid of the Romanian military, which now refused to follow Communist Party orders to subdue the movement. Ceausescu and his wife fled the building by helicopter, but were captured later that day. 2 days later, the Ceausescus faced a hastily formed military court where they were found guilty and executed by firing squad.
When I was in the hospital in Austria, a Serbian news agency came. I told them I didn't mind so much the loss of my leg. After all, it was I who got to light the first candle.
Today, Dan Gavra, like his home city, Timișoara, still bears the scars of the revolution he helped to start 25 years ago. Dan faces many challenges on a daily basis, but the same determined young man who stood for God on a dark, cold night in December of 1989 still stands for God today.
My first contact with the Gavra family was through Dan's wife and daughters, and they came to our church. Eventually, Dan realized that this is where his family was being encouraged, was being challenged, and he immediately wanted to get involved. Dan currently comes on Saturdays, picks up my van, takes it and gets it washed and fueled if it needs to be, prepared for the next morning. And both he and his wife, he'll drive the van, she'll drive their car, and they'll go in a circuit through the neighborhood picking up people and bring about a dozen people or more in their 2 vehicles to church every Sunday. When I'm busy, overwhelmed, he's one of the first ones that comes up to me and just says, you know, Pastor, can I do something? That's just the kind of spirit he has. Anything he can do to serve, if I let him know, he's willing to do it. And that's such a tremendous blessing for a man that has gone through so much in his life.
I thank the Lord for how he has worked in my life. Though many would say that to lose a leg is a bad thing, to me it is a blessing, because through it, God has taught me many things. I know that all things work together for good to those that love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. God has given me a wife and 2 wonderful girls. God allows us to serve him as a family. He has given me a place to live, and truly it all began when I put my life into his hands and said, God, do with me what you want to do.
Through the renewing work of God in his life, Dan is committed to following Christ and leading his family for the Lord. Dan's story encourages us to take a stand for Christ and his church. It affirms for us that our actions and sacrifices do make a difference, and it compels us to turn from bitterness and bickering to give ourselves to sacrifice and service.
The communists had an agenda to make of me what they called the new man. Of course, by this they meant a new communist man. They didn't succeed. Rather, they brought out the animal in me and made me a thief and a criminal. But when I met Christ at Calvary and was born again, I truly became a new man.